the stitch package on the Baby Lock Jazz 2 is a one-step buttonhole. So let's go through the process of setting up for that buttonhole. The first thing that we're going to do is we're actually going to select the buttonhole stitch. And that is right next to stitch number 1. So now I am in the buttonhole or one-step buttonhole stitch mode. A couple of other things that I need to do. One of them is to adjust that stitch length. And when I start out, this is going to be dependent upon the thread that you're using and the fabric that you're stitching on. So you're always going to want to test your stitch length and that stitch width for your final buttonhole before you actually apply it, I should say, to your project. So I'm going to start off with a width of 5, and I'm going to place my length fairly close to that 0, but not right on that 0. I'm going to leave my needle in that down position, and my next step is actually to take my buttonhole attachment, and I need to load my button. Because this is a one-step system, the buttonhole or the buttonhole size is based on the size of my button. So to open the what I would call the compartment that the button sits in, we're going to push back on this plastic lever and slide that button in place and then close that. So now when I create my buttonhole, it's going to be based on this button. The next thing that we're going to do is to remove the standard presser foot or the presser foot you have on your machine, and we're actually going to attach the buttonhole foot. One more step before we can move on. Now that our buttonhole foot is attached, our button is in position, we're going to pull down the buttonhole lever. Now there's one more step that we have to take, and that is, you see the word push on there. We actually have to push that back so that it sits in a position that the lever or the guide on the buttonhole actually hits it, triggering the buttonhole attachment to advance to the next step. If this lever is not positioned correctly, you will not be stitching a buttonhole. It will just be a mass of zigzag stitches because there's no measuring system. You haven't told the machine that you want it to move or advance to the next step. Now what I have done is I have marked a line on my fabric, and that's going to be the position for my buttonhole. And I'm in a position so that this edge, the front edge of the buttonhole where you have the opening, is on that line, and I'm going to place my needle in the down position, and I'm going to stitch. And what it stitches first is it stitches that bottom, what I would call bar tack. And it's going to stitch that, and now as you can see, it's starting to stitch backwards. And I'm actually going to clip and remove that needle thread. I could let that continue to stitch. It would just be caught by the zigzag stitches in the buttonhole, and that's completely fine. So now as it's stitching backwards, once that silver lever hits the plastic measuring on the buttonhole attachment, it's going to start that top bar tack, and then it will come forward. And as it comes forward, what you're going to need to watch is that bottom bar tack. On this buttonhole, you have to visually stop stitching, because as long as you keep your foot on the foot control, that needle is going to go left and right, sewing in a sense that right side or that right leg, and you don't want those stitches to build up at the bottom of your buttonhole. So I'm going to keep stitching, and as it gets closer, I slow down so that I can make sure that I'm aligned with that bottom bar tack. I'm going to stop, take my needle out of the fabric, raise my presser foot, and then let's take a look at our buttonhole. Very nice. It's actually a very nice buttonhole. I could probably loosen up my stitch length a little bit. For this heavyweight cotton fabric, I think it's perfect. If it were a lighter weight fabric, I would not want that as tight, because what will happen is the buttonhole will be heavier than the fabric. Now, I did prep my fabric by placing a stabilizer, fusible stabilizer, on the back side. So to do the next buttonhole, I would simply move to that position. Again, I'm going to lower that, but here's the trick. You would think that that buttonhole lever would say in the position. It doesn't. You have to remember to, on every buttonhole, is to push that again to that back position so that you can start your next buttonhole. And again, it starts at bottom bar tack, and then it will do the left side going backwards. And once it gets to the position where the silver lever hits that plastic lever, you can see how close that is, then it will start the top bar tack. Once that top bar tack is done, it's going to come forward, and again, I am going to watch to make sure that I don't build up stitches at that bottom bar tack. And right now my needle is in the left position. I always like to take my needle into the right position because that in a sense completes that stitch. I'm going to take my needle out of the fabric, pull my fabric out from underneath, clip my threads, and my second buttonhole is done, and it looks identical to my first. So if I wanted to add another buttonhole, again, push that lever back so that you're telling the machine that you want to stitch a buttonhole. So that's how easy it is to create a buttonhole on the Baby Lock Jazz. One last thing about buttonholes that I think you'll find very helpful is that there may be a time or two that your buttonhole legs don't look exactly the same. And if we look at this buttonhole, you'll notice that the left side is not as dense as the right side. So how do you fix that? Located at the top of your machine is what we call a buttonhole fine-tuning adjustment position. Now, how this works is, since the buttonhole has two sides, meaning a left leg and a right leg, this adjustment screw is the exact same thing. If I turn that screw to the left, what I'm doing is I'm affecting the density of the left leg, meaning now that's going to make that more compact. If I were to turn the screw to the right side after it's centered, it would do the same thing. It would make that right side more compact. So when, in this case, if I were adjusting this, I would turn my screw to the left ever so slightly, and then what I would do is stitch out my buttonhole again to see if I now match density-wise. If I needed to adjust it again, I would just turn that screw just a little bit. The more you turn the screw to the left, or the more you turn it to the right, the denser the leg is going to become. So just remember that. Home place, or home, is when the screw is actually vertical. You may never have to adjust the legs on your buttonhole while you're sewing, but if you should, you now know where to go to make that adjustment.